January 2015. I learned, in the quiet way that habits are learned, to begin most of my explanations to caseworkers the same way, not with a policy brief, but with a human scene. It was the winter before we began drafting budgets and spreadsheets, the winter when there was still time in a meeting to tell a single story and watch how it rearranged the room. I would tell them about the woman who held an eviction notice because she'd spent the last money in her account on diesel. She had driven her uncle to a clinic in a town 2 hours away. The diesel was the last money she had. That one small, concrete detail, one line in a long list of bullet points, changed how people listened. The room, trained to pass eligibility thresholds and documentation protocols, would look up. Abstract rules became the record of a life lived. Policy stopped being a ledger and started being something that touched a person. I learned to use story not as ornament but as the first tool of translation, how an abstract problem, housing instability, appears in a life at 3 a.m., the clatter of a landlord's key in a lock, a child coughing in an icy room. The first thing a caseworker heard, I discovered, was not the statutory language but the shape of urgency. The woman with the diesel bill made the policy questions concrete. What would legal counsel do when pay cycles misaligned with rent? How could a system act faster than a check cycle? How could assistance be precise enough to meet that diesel purchase at the right time so a life did not unravel? That habit of narrating a life as the hinge for an argument was not merely rhetorical. It was born of earlier ruptures in my own life, quieter events that shaped the view I brought into public service. My mother left when I was young. The reasons made sense to her: a cheap plane ticket and the promise of work, or perhaps the desire to escape a life that had no room for her. She handed me $20 and a list of practical instructions and went. For a long time I lived inside that $20 story as abandonment. Later, as I studied programs and budgets and the practical ways help reaches people, I came to see it in another light, not a clean act of mercy, but a crude lifeline. It was imperfect and stingy, but it taught 2 lessons I would return to repeatedly. The first lesson: small instruments, cash, a list, a number to call, can pivot someone from crisis toward possibility. The second: dignity is negotiated in a pinch. How you give help matters as much as whether you give it. Those lessons informed more than rhetoric. They became the grammar of design. In the years I spent designing programs, I kept returning to the memory of that cheap ticket and the sense that a single small decision could have long reverberations. March, June 2015. Between March and June of 2015, we sketched what would become a modest instrument, a small emergency stabilization fund. From the beginning we defined what it was not an ongoing subsidy, not a replacement for comprehensive welfare, not a panacea for structural inequalities. It was intended to be a buffer, a short-term intervention that bought breathing room. We argued, sometimes quietly and sometimes with urgency, that this fund should be used for things like a week's groceries when food ran out, a motel room for a locked-out household at night, a one-time deposit to secure a new lease, or payment of an emergency utility bill after a shut-off notice arrived. The principle was simple and humane. Cash distributions had to be tethered to a service plan. Money without a plan is temporary relief. Money plus a plan is a scaffold that endures. Those months were preoccupied with translation, how to convert the impulse to help into rules that would hold up to auditors and the skeptical light of committee hearings. We debated eligibility thresholds until we could recite them in our sleep. We argued about caps and frequency. How much should be a one-time deposit? How many motel nights could we authorize for a family? The work required a constant toggling between empathy and technicality. I insisted that we make the fund operationally simple. So simple that a single caseworker in a late-night intake conversation could request assistance without routing through a labyrinth of approvals. The political calculus was present in every choice. A program too large in scope would be killed before it opened. A program too small would be useless. We deliberately sized the instrument to be politically viable and operationally auditable. Late 2015, spring 2016. We carried that design into budget hearings in late 2015 and into the spring of 2016. The argument we rehearsed in council chambers was small and stubborn. When you can tell a named story and buttress it with a spreadsheet, you earn a hearing. When you can show checks and balances are in place, you earn a vote. We promised accountability, dashboards, audit trails, eligibility documentation, outcome measures, because political survival demanded it. At the same time, we refused to allow auditability to crush the human elbow room the fund was meant to create. March 1, 2016. On March 1, 2016, the city formally launched the pilot fund. It was a modest allocation by any measure, intentionally restrained so it could survive public scrutiny. We built into its design the contradiction we lived with every day. To be meaningful, the fund needed to be large enough to matter to families in crisis. To survive, it needed to be small enough to sit comfortably within a conservative political calculus. We signed that compromise into the program's architecture, accountable enough to satisfy auditors, humane enough to stabilize lives. June 2016. The pilot's visibility invited the usual chorus of critics almost immediately. By June 2016, as the first quarterly report circulated, some accused the initiative of sentimentality, of confusing short-term help with structural reform. Others said we were naive to expect bureaucracy to bend. There were days I shared that impatience. There were nights we rewrote legal memos until the margins thinned. We accepted compromises that felt painful, reporting requirements, third-party audits, an outcomes dashboard that tracked every dollar and every client outcome, but we did so as a tactical concession. We promised transparency, and we kept in sight the reason the fund existed: to hold a life steady long enough to connect a person to services that could be durable. June-September 2016. That summer we moved from concept to a functioning workflow. We knew a family facing imminent removal could not wait days for a signature. Practical design forced us into operational constraints. By September 2016 we had established mechanisms that made the fund responsive: a 24-hour hotline and a fast workflow, intake, verification, authorization, disbursement, and follow-up, each step deliberately short. Payments were wired to landlords and vendors, motel vouchers issued, or modest deposits transferred into accounts with receipts attached. We insisted that payments go to vendors when possible. Handing cash to someone on a sidewalk felt like leaving dignity to chance. September 2016. Operational detail required more than speed, it required legibility. We built a rudimentary dashboard and, by January 2017, launched it so management and auditors could see requests, approvals, and attached services in near real time. Documentation mattered because it turned claims of humanity into auditable practice. It is one thing to say you are saving a family's housing. It is another to show the wire transfer and the follow-up housing advocate's note. June-September 2016. Peer support and certification. During those same months we piloted peer support roles across several agencies, an explicit admission that those who had navigated the system could offer a kind of help trained professionals sometimes could not. The pilot began in June 2016 with a modest cohort of peers embedded in intake units. We designed a short certification curriculum, 2 weeks of practical instruction launched in September 2016, that covered confidentiality, de-escalation, note-taking that did not reduce a person to a file, and how to help a parent sketch a realistic first-month survival plan. The curriculum was deliberately practical: how to take notes without making someone feel like a case file, how to help a parent plan around childcare, and which community resources could plug a hole immediately. October 2016. In October 2016 we introduced the Blue Folder, a low-tech tool that became shorthand across the field. Workers helped clients assemble one at intake: birth certificate copies, a list of emergency numbers, medication lists, and a counselor card. Each folder included a card with the fund coordinator's contact number and a note that read, in bold handwriting, "Call Janice. Do not go alone." The folder was not a magical device, but it made survival legible. When a landlord called, a caseworker could produce documentation, a deposit record, and a written plan for how the tenant would catch up. Legibility built trust. March 1, 2017. The first case that taught me how that hinge between convenience and ruin worked arrived on March 1, 2017. Exactly 1 year after the fund's launch. Rosa walked into our office with 3 suitcases and a toddler. Her face was the color of an overcast afternoon. She carried the fatigue of a worker whose schedule never aligned with the world's services. She had been told by her landlord to move within a week after an incident on the floor below. She worked a payroll that left her between cycles, twice a month. When paychecks and obligations didn't align, there was no cushion. We authorized a motel voucher for a week, wired a small deposit overnight to secure a new apartment, and put in place a service calendar for the first month. We arranged a meeting with a housing advocate, set up transportation assistance for necessary paperwork, and scheduled a job coaching session that helped her plan interviews around childcare. The case produced no headlines. It was not a mythic turnaround. But 6 weeks later, in mid-April 2017, Rosa signed a lease. She sent a photograph of her son holding a crust of pizza in the new living room, grinning as if safety were an ordinary thing. Those quiet, ordinary endings, small recoveries that never make the front page, became the memory that steadied us when the work felt abstract. May 2017. My mother's relationship to the work shifted in a concrete way that spring. She came back into my life not as a tidy chapter in my past but as a present participant. She watched meetings sometimes skeptically, often with the fierce concentration of someone who had been through her own measures of scarcity and shame. At a meeting in May 2017 she met Rosa. My mother understood at once what an overnight wire or a motel voucher meant in the daily geometry of a family's life. For her, watching a rent deposit wired and an eviction notice treated as a solvable emergency was proof that services could be precise and humane. A truth she had not believed before. Her presence reframed why the fund mattered. It was not only an exercise in fiscal prudence, it was the logistical mechanism that prevented disappearance. After that meeting, my mother began to volunteer in a more formal capacity, mentoring families during their first month of enrollment. Her credibility came from friction. People trusted her because she knew intimately what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a program that actually followed through. Her gestures, folding a blanket with the exact crease of someone who had slept in motel rooms, showing a mother how to set a bill reminder on her phone, insisting a father take a bus card, were small but exact. They were the kinds of things money could buy only if attached to thoughtfulness and logistics. August 2017. Her public presence reopened old wounds. In August 2017, at a community meeting convened to build local trust in the pilot, someone across the room asked loudly whether she regretted leaving me with $20 when she left. The question was direct and meant to sting. My mother answered, as she often did in public, with a factual recounting and then a calm denial of the question's implication. Afterwards she apologized for the sting and told me she had learned the art of asking for help the hard way. "It's one thing to tell people to ask," she said. "It's another to show them how to ask without becoming a target." That sentence became a touchstone for our programming. Teach people not only to accept help but to negotiate it, to preserve dignity as they received assistance. It bridged the personal and the political. Her lesson in absence returned as a method for public policy. Late 2016, summer 2017, we also pushed into legal arenas. In late 2016 and into 2017 we advocated for judges to require plans with benchmarks in custody and neglect hearings. Roadmaps with concrete steps instead of vague admonishments. Some judges embraced the idea, others resisted, seeing benchmarks as intrusive. We learned an ugly lesson quickly. A plan without funding was a cruel order. Families were disciplined for failing to meet requirements that lacked resources. By the summer of 2017, we changed our position. No plan should be acceptable unless the services it required were budgeted and available. The paperwork of reform had to be paired with dollars and cents. A plan without a budget is a promise without a mechanism. September 2017. The political climate hardened in September 2017. A local talk radio host, skilled at stoking outrage, labeled the emergency cash handouts for the imprudent, and asked why taxpayers should subsidize rent for people who bring trouble into their homes. The rhetoric was performative and dehumanizing. As listenership spiked, elected officials reached for easy headlines and scapegoats. Some politicians postured against the fund without engaging the daily realities it addressed. The coalition that had built the pilot convened people who had used the fund and asked them to testify plainly. A waitress who had fallen behind 2 weeks after a medical emergency and a slow payroll cycle described how a single payment kept her son in his school. An older man described a January motel voucher that prevented him from sleeping in his car and allowed him to attend an intake appointment the next morning. The testimonies were precise: dates, amounts, ripple effects, and the more precise they were, the harder it became for critics to cast recipients as anonymous others. Public hearings turned into a human ledger. Names, numbers, and the practical effects of one-time cash infusions. Early 2018, the fund survived the attacks but not without consequence. In early 2018, the City Council imposed modest cuts. We lost flexibility and had to become even more scrupulous with metrics. That period taught us a harsh lesson about the precariousness of progress. Reforms can be enacted, but they must be defended constantly. My mother sat through one of the hearings in February 2018 and held my hand through the council's vote. Afterwards, she told me she understood how policy can be a kind of fight that never truly ends, an unglamorous persistence. She said she was proud, and the word had a small domestic weight. When I pressed my forehead to hers, I could see a constellation of veins at her temple. Pride, earned like that, felt like a private victory against quotidian cruelties. July 2018, operational rigor, which we had insisted upon from the start, became an essential defense. Auditors wanted receipts and service links. By the mid-year audit in July 2018, we could show that nearly all cases had clear referrals and that the fund prevented costlier outcomes in many instances. We constructed mixed-method metrics, quantitative tallies of nights averted and deposits paid paired with qualitative follow-ups, photographs from new living rooms, notes from therapists, a child's teacher confirming school attendance. The combined evidence persuaded skeptical officials in ways simple rhetoric could not. October 2018. There were quieter victories that meant more than any plaque or op-ed. In October 2018, my son came home with a violin and a folded piece of paper, recital Saturday. He practiced in the living room, initially clumsy, letting the bow scrape before finding a line that sounded like music. My mother took the bus to the recital because she said driving at night made her nervous. She sat in the third row, hands folded, scarf wrapped like a habit. When my son took his bow, the hall's applause was modest and she clapped loud enough for everyone to hear. Afterwards she confessed she had once wanted to be a kid with a violin case she thought of as a strange grown-up thing. Now the case at home was an object of curiosity. He did not know the exact meaning of the $20 memory my mother carried, but he understood patterns, lists, spare keys, a friend who will water plants. Those images, blue folders, spare keys, violin cases, are the ordinary scaffolds of a durable life. The day-to-day choreography. Much of what the fund accomplished was mundane logistics and quiet interventions that, assembled together, had outsized effects. A hotline operator at midnight finding a motel room, a caseworker wiring a deposit overnight, a peer coach sitting with a parent through a form until the lines blurred and only dignity remained. These are not heroic stories. But they are the texture of what stability means. A night without rain leaking through a tent seam, a receipt that prevents an eviction notice from being processed, a bus card that gets a child back into class. I remember an intake on a cold Thursday. A woman arrived with socks wet from a bus ride and a child with a fever. The clinician was tied up in court. The caseworker had a full caseload. The hotline operator called every motel until one had a vacancy, arranged emergency childcare for 2 hours, and secured a same-day medical appointment for the child. That night the mother slept in a bed. The next morning she could take her child to the clinic and, later, complete the form she had been too exhausted the night before to face. These scenes do not lend themselves to dramatic narratives, but they reveal how small interventions accumulate. Boundaries and tensions. Human relationships resist perfect systematization. My mother and I still argued about boundaries. Her habit of dropping by unannounced, rearranging my pantry, touching my refrigerator magnets sometimes felt like an erosion of autonomy. Her explanation was always the same. She worried too much to wait. We had to learn how to set limits while preserving the capacity to give and receive care. The field had the same tension. Helping did not mean taking over someone's life. Setting limits did not mean abandoning them. We taught workers to map dignity and assistance together. One of the program's ongoing tensions was the balance between rigor and responsiveness. Too many hoops destabilize families before help arrives. Too little rigor leaves the program politically vulnerable. We iterated constantly. We refined applications, shortened verification timelines, tightened audits, and kept the human side visible. Each revision was text written in response to a problem, and each problem had a name and a face. That is what made our paperwork different from mere bureaucracy. It was a map of what could break and what could mend. Peer work and employment pathways. A major strand of our labor focused on pathways out of poverty into stable employment that connected directly to the systems that served people. Cash plus navigation led more reliably to stability than cash alone. We paired emergency funds with job coaching, employer connections, and peer support. Peer coaches knew which employers offered flexible hours or second-chance hiring practices. They taught clients how to explain work interruptions in ways that did not preclude employment. Those pairings reduced recidivism. Fewer repeat requests to the fund meant a case that might have recurred became instead a single, teachable moment. The peer support certification, launched in late 2016, became a durable innovation. Peers were trained in boundary work and first-month plans, lists of who to call for childcare, locations for free winter coats, and how to document lost wages for an employer. They learned when to escalate to clinicians and how to support without taking on someone else's burdens. They became the bridge between crisis and stability. Legal negotiation and judges' benchmarks. Our push for judges' benchmarks was wise but contentious. Some judges saw benchmarks as micromanaging family life. We adjusted by requiring that benchmarks be co-created with families and realistically funded. The legal community's feedback reshaped our approach. Provide judges with a menu of funded services that aligned with common benchmarks so when a plan was requested, the plan was actionable rather than aspirational. We produced that menu in 2017 and distributed it in local courthouses. Whether judges used it depended on the human relationships we had cultivated over months of meetings. Prevention work. Prevention mattered as much as emergency response. Some funds were reserved for prevention work. Mobile health screenings with community clinics starting in early 2017 to intercept conditions that might lead to missed work, landlord mediation services to preempt evictions by arranging partial payments and realistic catch-up plans. Prevention was unglamorous but cost-effective, fewer emergency payments, lower caseloads, and shorter shelter stays. I recall a landlord who agreed to accept a 3-month plan after a trust-building meeting where we showed him a blue folder and the scheduler's note for childcare subsidies. These modest logistical agreements averted crisis more cheaply than eviction proceedings ever could. Public communications and political survival. Language mattered. Terms like handout and paternalism were weaponized to shut down debate. We adopted neutral, dignified phrasing in our communications: emergency stabilization, short-term cash assistance, navigational supports. We emphasized agency. The fund preserved a person's capacity to make choices, and framed interventions as investments in keeping a child in school and a parent in work. Language shaped perception and political defense. When the radio rhetoric spiked in September 2017, we responded with details, not anger. We distributed case vignettes and simplified cost-benefit comparisons. A motel voucher plus a referral could be cheaper than removing children and placing them into foster care. Those calculations are not emotionally satisfying, but in a policy process that prizes numbers they are persuasive. Sustaining coalitions. Sustaining the fund required a coalition: caseworkers who became advocates, judges who adopted alternatives to removal, neighbors who brought soup and watered plants, non-profit leaders who kept the story alive in council chambers. It required op-eds, testimony, audits, and daily practice. When budgets tightened, we learned to make the case for measured, cost-effective interventions with the same care we used to assemble blue folders. The most durable support came not from banners or speeches but from mundane acts: a supervisor who authorized a deposit that morning, a judge who asked whether the plan came with a budget, a neighbor who agreed to water plants during a motel stay. The moral work. There is a humility to this work I lacked when I was younger. I still carry resentment for a system that smelled more of judgment than solace when I came of age, but I carry gratitude too. Gratitude for the caseworker who called a neighbor at midnight, for the judge who insisted on a funded plan, for the counselor who taught my mother to name panic as an illness rather than a sin. These people, neighbors, workers, judges, mothers, decided that institutions could be nudged toward care. That modest faith in the possibility of institutions is fragile, it must be defended. But it is, I think, the best inheritance I can give my son, the knowledge that systems can be nudged to be kinder, and that ordinary people can build small scaffolds that keep life from tipping over. A ledger of small savories. I kept a small, anonymized file of cases that illustrated the fund's work: a motel in January, a deposit wired overnight, a child who stayed in school because a parent could afford bus fare. When the budget faced attack in municipal hearings or on radio, we used those files. People remember faces and concrete details. Numbers alone do not move hearts. Paired, the stories and numbers did political work. The file became a ledger of small savories, receipts, photographs, a child's drawing sent by a grateful parent, a landlord's note saying thanks, not for charity, but for a workable arrangement. Repetition and reinforcement. We returned to the same prescriptions in classrooms and at kitchen tables. When I teach policy students, the lessons are mundane and chronological. First, design fund line items that frontline workers can access. Second, pair cash with checklists and services. Third, hire people with lived experience and pay them professional wages. These prescriptions are not romantic. They are practical. At holiday dinners I say simpler things. Leave an extra milk in the fridge, program your numbers into your phone, keep a spare key with someone you trust. The bureaucratic and the domestic overlap constantly. They meet, awkwardly and beautifully, around a living room where a violin practices and a blue folder sits on a shelf. That overlap is where repair happens, between the ledger and the casserole, the caseworker's calendar and a mother's checklist. The suitcase and the blue folder. The suitcase returns to my mind in quiet hours, a stitched memory of flight and leftover money. There is a note sewn into a lining, call Janice. Do not go alone. There is a return ticket in a zipper pocket, a counselor's name on a card, and a folded list of neighbors willing to check in. The $20 bill is there. My mother's memory of leaving me as a child, but it sits beside things that matter more, a map, a phone number, a plan. That small packet, the documents that make survival legible, is a simple bureaucratic device that says you do not have to disappear to survive. For me, it is a metaphor for what policy should be, small instruments of repair that are legible, navigable, and reliably available. Ongoing fights and the need for vigilance. The political defense of a small stipend is a perpetual process. Every time a budget cycle approached, we rehearsed the case files. Motel vouchers avoided, deposits wired, children kept in classrooms. We told those stories in hearings in October 2018 and again in spring 2019, and each telling mattered. The fund survived with adjustments. We learned to be ever more precise, to refine the verification process, and to keep the human narratives visible. Reforms can be enacted, they must then be defended. The cultural shift inside agencies. Some changes were cultural rather than structural. Supervisors began to say, "We can do this today," because authorizing a small payment became not only permissible but expected in certain circumstances. Caseworkers stopped defaulting to "we don't have authority," and learned protocols that empowered action. That change of posture, from documenting to solving, was one of the program's deepest impacts. I remember a supervisor, hardened by decades of managing caseloads, standing at a staff meeting and saying simply, "Today, I authorized a deposit." It felt like throwing a rope. His words were both literal and metaphorical. We could make the systems catch people. What the fund did not claim, we did not pretend the program formed a tidy arc from suffering to redemption. People still fall through systems. There are nights when I make frantic calls only to find waitlists and timetables that stretch too far for a mother who needs help now. The fund did not and could not erase the underlying structural problems of poverty, housing shortage, and labor precarity. But the existence of an alternative matters. Knowing a different bureaucratic posture is possible changes choices. For some parents, the option of a supportive, non-judgmental intervention is the hinge on which futures are made. My mother's work and its complexity. My mother's presence in the work was both complicated and generative. Her decision to volunteer invited public scrutiny, and old resentments surfaced in ways I had to navigate. Her forgiveness of the past was partial, mine was too. The way she sat at desks, mentoring young mothers and teaching practical steps. Make a list of who to call, keep copies of vital documents in a blue folder, have someone named Janice who you call and do not go alone, taught more about resilience than any seminar. She taught by example how a practical checklist can be a lifeline. Why small instruments matter. We built the fund to be small enough to be politically viable and large enough to make a difference. We insisted on accountability because evidence matters in a democracy that too often prizes spectacle. We insisted that help be paired with navigation because a dollar without a path is an empty promise. We insisted that people who had been helped be paid to help others because lived experience is expertise. Those insistences were not technicalities. They were the bones of a program that sought to respect dignity while stabilizing families. At the end of the day, policy work lives in repetition and in the small acts that make life bearable: a supervisor's call, a motel voucher issued in the night, a peer sitting across a tiny kitchen table and saying, "You don't have to have it all figured out." The work is unglamorous and constant. It is, in practice, a discipline of humility. When I teach, when I testify, when I write a budget memo, I return to the same chronology and the same practical steps. Design accessible line items, pair cash with concrete services, train and pay peers, make survival legible with simple tools like a blue folder, defend the program with numbers and faces. At home, I tell simpler things. Leave an extra milk in the fridge, program emergency numbers into your phone, keep a spare key with someone you trust. Those overlapping practices, bureaucratic and domestic, are where repair happens. Sometimes when I am tired, I imagine folding that suitcase again. I think of the $20 bill tucked into a pocket beside a map and a list of names. But mostly I think of the blue folder on the shelf, my son practicing his violin, and my mother humming in the kitchen. Those images are not the record of a miraculous cure. They are the record of sustained moral and political effort, small acts, repeated and defended, that change the ordinary lives of people you know and love. That, to me, is the purpose of policy, to provide practical scaffolding that holds a life steady so that when crisis comes, people do not have to disappear to survive. When the child protection file was first opened, it began as the sort of shorthand that agencies use when they want to make a problem legible. The phrase in the paperwork, parental absence, unsupervised minor, read like a diagnostic slogan rather than a story. I had been 11 when my mother folded a $20 bill into my hand, tucked a scrap of paper inside a patched suitcase, and left for a month in Europe. The radio played as she packed, someone joked about the single mother on an adventure, and someone else whispered that she had abandoned me. A neighbor called a hotline. A caseworker came to the apartment and asked the standard questions. The file began with dates and checkboxes, then grew into something more complicated. What CPS found when they looked beyond the initial checkbox was hardly a tidy vindication or a neat moral lesson, but it did change the trajectory of the paperwork and therefore, my mother's life. They found a list of supports sewn into the lining of a suitcase, Janice's number penciled on a receipt, a return ticket with a date, the name of a counselor, a plan that had room for imperfection. They found neighbors who could corroborate their willingness to check in, a teacher who had taken responsibility for a list of emergency contacts, and, most crucially, a blue folder that held copies of birth certificates and a simple checklist titled "Do Not Go Alone." The file recorded that the plan was imperfect and that the situation warranted attention, but it also recorded something less quantifiable, that the family had layered practical scaffolding into a fragile moment. In the months that followed, the caseworker recommended voluntary services rather than removal. The language in the case notes, parents receptive to referral, neighbor supports in place, recommended counseling, did not erase stigma, but it shaped a different institutional response. There was a class of possible outcomes the file might have produced, and the one chosen was not the most punitive. That bureaucratic decision, made in a house with a violin on the couch and a blue folder on the shelf, is the hinge on which much of my later thinking swings. It is also the hinge on which my mother later leaned as she offered her time to other families. She had been through the interrogation of a file and come through not as a spectacle but as someone whose messy, earnest plan had been recognized by someone with the power to decide. The record left behind did not feel like victory. The file returned to haunt us in small ways. Background checks, forms, moments when a reference to prior child welfare involvement made a landlord frown or a supervisor pause. But it also shaped a kind of authority that governments and non-profits had begun to value, the expertise of survival. When, years later, the city experimented with the small fund we designed, vouchers, deposits, short-term cash paired with navigation, my mother's prior interactions with CPS gave her a credibility among peers. She was not only someone who had been failed by a system, she was someone who knew how to sit with caseworkers and tell the truth that agencies could act upon. The chronology matters. In September 2017, when radio rhetoric spiked and we drafted talking points, We were reacting not only to public fear but to the memory of that first file. In October 2018 we stood in council chambers, blue folders in hand, illustrating the fund with vignettes derived from real life rather than theoretical models. In spring 2019 we doubled down on accountability and trained peers to be navigators. Then, in March 2020, everything accelerated. The pandemic did not invent need, it made visible needs that were already fracturing. When mayors' emergency declarations shuttered classrooms and warehouses, the fund's small, flexible nature became unexpectedly essential. Where long procurement cycles would have frozen many programs, the fund's design, authorized disbursements for frontline supervisors, partnered referrals to motel managers and community counselors, allowed immediate action. Caseworkers used the same practices we had insisted upon: pair a cash deposit with a referral, wire a motel voucher with a list of neighbors who would check in. The blue folder, once a private artifact, became a recommended practice across agencies. Keep copies of documents, program emergency contacts into your phone, name the person you call, and do not go alone. The context of 2020 reshaped political arguments. Face-to-face hearings moved to video. Public testimonies were recorded in living rooms. We watched, with a kind of exhausted relief, as judges began to ask about funded plans in arrears hearings, and as supervisors who had once defaulted to no authority learned how to authorize an emergency voucher over a phone call. The fund did not eliminate precarity, but during a period when hotels were empty and temporary shelter became a public health measure, the fund's nimbleness kept some families from entering a cascade of system involvement. That same period also exposed limits. Waitlists lengthened as landlords struggled, eviction moratoria created backlogs that could not be solved with single-night interventions, and the fund's small scale meant that not everyone who needed help could be served. Still, the choices made in 2017 to 2019, documented protocols, paid peers, the insistence on pairing cash with navigation, allowed the program to respond in 2020 in ways it otherwise could not have. In the municipal budgets of 2021 and 2022, those practical results became the basis of political defense. We testified about preserved school attendance, about families who did not enter foster systems, about neighbors who kept plants watered and checked doors at night. When skeptical council members asked for proof, we returned with the ledger of small savories, photographs, affidavits from motels, a child's drawing pinned to a receipt. Those details carried force. The political landscape shifted with the economy. In 2022, a new administration proposed a tightening of discretionary funds. Opponents resurrected the anxious rhetoric that had once dominated local talk radio, and once again we learned the peculiar discipline of storytelling. Repeat the same concrete narratives, file after file, morning meeting after morning meeting. The fund survived, adjusted in line items and verification requirements, but the debates hardened. By 2023, an independent audit, commissioned as part of a larger budget showdown, asked the question we had been answering in staff meetings for years: did small, immediate interventions actually prevent costlier, more intrusive interventions later? The audit did not render moral judgment, it offered comparative trajectories. The numbers were neither elegant nor decisive in isolation, but when paired with the human files they formed a persuasive case. Practical scaffolding reduced churn, preserved school enrollment, and in many cases kept families off court dockets. Those results translated into modest scaling in late 2023 and into a regional exchange of protocols in early 2024. Cities in neighboring counties asked to see the blue folder, the case vignettes, the checklists we distributed. My mother, who had once been defined by a single file, began to travel, online and in person, to tell her story. She spoke in shelters and in conference rooms, not as an expert in legal doctrine but as a living argument for a different bureaucratic posture. Her presence invited scrutiny. Old resentments surfaced in op-eds and comments. But there were also moments of recognition. A judge who once questioned a file invited my mother to speak to a bench about the meaning of voluntary services. A supervisor who had once been hardened by caseloads called her an instructive teacher. That language mattered, so did the routines she taught. Program your numbers into your phone, keep a spare key with someone you trust, have a Janice. The cultural shift inside agencies was not uniform. In 2024, some offices embraced the posture of urgency paired with humility. Others reverted to a checklist mentality, a bureaucratic reflex that equated protection with exclusion. The work of sustaining the fund required attention not only to budgets but to the micro-practices of supervision. Each new training cycle involved the quiet labor of convincing managers that authorizing a deposit was not an abdication of responsibility but an exercise of it. I learned to translate those micro-practices into teaching modules. Role-play a night when a mother calls at 10 p.m., practice authorizing an emergency deposit, run through a referral to a peer who knows how to talk someone down from panic. When I testified before legislative committees in 2024, I carried examples from our ledger: a motel in January, a deposit wired overnight, a child who stayed in school because a parent could afford bus fare. The timeline: 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2023, 2024, became a narrative spine that allowed listeners to see change as cumulative, not episodic. There were harder lessons too. The presence of a blue folder, a neighbor, or Janice did not immunize a family from systemic churn. Mental health resources were chronically underfunded. Housing stock shrank in the face of a market that prized speculation. People still fell through the cracks, and sometimes the cracks widened. Yet the fund's existence created new choices. For some parents, the alternative, an offered, funded plan that prioritized keeping a child in school and a parent in work, was literally the hinge that kept family life from tipping into the juvenile justice or foster care systems. Its existence mattered in ways auditors and op-eds could measure imperfectly. On the personal side, my mother's relationship with the system remained complicated. The CPS file from my childhood was part scar and part credential. It complicated background checks and sometimes prompted paternalism from social workers who assumed knowledge of her past. But it also made her an effective mentor because she knew the language of the file and the shape of the defenses people deploy when they are afraid. She taught new peers to speak plainly with caseworkers, to insist on funded plans, to archive receipts and photographs. In 2024, a small nonprofit hired her as a paid peer mentor. The employment was not a ceremonial victory, it was payment for expertise forged in the scorched gullies of survival. And yet public scrutiny can be relentless. When the local paper ran a profile on the fund in June 2024, a commentator dredged up the old story, an 11-year-old left with $20, and suggested that leniency toward irresponsible parents had grown into a kind of permissiveness. We responded, as we had learned to do, with details. We published the case notes that showed the return ticket and Janice's number. We described decisions made on particular nights and the outcomes in subsequent months. The exchange was protracted and unpleasant, but it made an argument in public that bureaucratic nuance could be defended by factual narratives. Between hearings and op-eds, the quotidian discipline of policy persisted. Supervisors authorized deposits in the middle of storms. Judges asked whether a plan came with a budget. Neighbors agreed to water plants during an adult's short stay in a motel. A counselor taught a mother how to name panic as an illness rather than a sin. These were the centering rituals. They were the grainy transactions that composed a public life. The ledger, receipts, photographs, drawings, grew. So did the blue folder population across households in our city: copies of birth certificates, a counselor's card, Janice's number. The image that so often returns to me is ordinary: a blue folder on a shelf, a violin practicing in the background, a mother humming while she writes a list. The larger structural questions remained. How to scale a program that required both trust and small-dollar flexibility. How to sustain political coalitions when budgets cyclically tightened. How to train new cohorts of supervisors to prioritize solving over documenting. Each year brought an iteration. In late 2024, we piloted a regional training network that paired seasoned supervisors with new hires for 6 months of shadowing. In early 2025, we partnered with a community college to create a certificate for peer navigators, acknowledging lived experience as a credential requiring pedagogy and pay. Those efforts were incremental, and they required the same moral humility the fund demanded. Do not promise more than you can deliver. Keep the ledger of small savories visible. Pay peers as professionals. My son grows up in the mid-2020s with these institutional artifacts. He practices his violin in a room that holds, on its shelf, a blue folder and a small anonymized file of cases I keep for teaching. He asks about Janice sometimes, and I tell him that people have anchors, and that those anchors make being brave possible. The suitcase sits in the attic, stitched and patched, the $20 bill still tucked in a pocket like a relic. Sometimes he asks if the $20 saved me, and I tell him that it did not and that it did. It was a symbol and a practical thing, but it was the plan and the neighbor and the caseworker who actually mattered. The story is not finished. There are upcoming hearings scheduled for the spring budget of 2026 where the fund will again be defended. There are new municipal elections looming that may reshape the coalitions that have sustained small instruments of repair. There will be more auditions of public rhetoric and more attempts to reduce complicated human lives to tidy narratives. For now, the work continues in daily acts. A supervisor authorizes a deposit at midnight, a peer sits across a kitchen table, a judge asks whether a plan comes with a budget, and mothers teach other mothers how to keep documents in a blue folder and call Janice and not go alone. Those acts accumulate into policy. They are not glamorous. They are not a cure. But they are a way of making public institutions less likely to require disappearance as the only route to survival, and that is a kind of ongoing progress I intend to defend in the hearings to come. In the months that followed, the hearings scheduled for spring 2026 took on the weight of a political referendum. We filed exhibits in late 2025, the Blue Folder Compendium, anonymized birth certificates, notarized affidavits from neighbors, the Janice contact cards, receipts for motel rooms, a copy of the return ticket the mother had shown a caseworker in 2012, and the audit appendices from 2023. The opposition circulated a narrative that condensed the file into a single, vivid image, an 11-year-old with $20 on a kitchen table. That image had already become a cultural shorthand in op-eds and talk radio segments. It was the line opponents used to cast the fund as a subsidy for irresponsible parents. Our job in the weeks before the hearings was to insist on chronological specificity and documentary context. 2012, when the original CPS intervention took place, 2017 to 2019, when pilot protocols were developed, 2020 to 2022, when the fund demonstrated emergency responsiveness, 2023 to 2025, when scaling and pedagogy were piloted. Dates mattered not only as a record but as a way to resist the collapsing of complex life into a single, moralizing snapshot. The CPS file from my childhood, the scarred document that had served both as credential and as grievance, landed at the center of the debate in a way that surprised me. For years the file had been used inside agencies as a teaching text, something that social workers might consult to understand how fear and contingency interact in the making of a record. At the public sessions in March 2026, however, the file was dragged into bright daylight. Opponents read from it selectively. They pointed to the line that noted insufficient supervision, and read it as if that small phrase contained a lifetime of neglect. We had to show the rest of the page. The notation that a neighbor had been identified, the presence of a return ticket, the mother's subsequent enrollment in a parenting program, the child's school attendance records showing no prolonged absence. We had to make explicit what had always been implicit for those of us who had worked the file. An administrative finding does not equal a moral verdict. It is a bureaucratic classification with consequences, sometimes helpful, sometimes punitive, rarely simple. What CPS had found, in procedural terms, was uneven risk and the presence of a plan. My mother's file recorded both concern and contingency. She had left me with instructions, with Janice's number on a post-it, and with $20 folded into a pocket. The investigating social worker noted that the child had been safe on the day of the visit and that neighbors reported monitoring the house. The case was opened to voluntary services rather than to court petitioning. That administrative path, voluntary services, a plan to connect the parent with resources, and no removal, later became the hinge upon which our argument for small-dollar emergency funding turned. The file was not an exoneration, it was a record of choices made under scarcity, choices that social workers were not always trained to read as evidence of resilience. It was also evidence of what happens when an agency decides to interpret a plan as worth supporting rather than as proof of culpability. That interpretive choice, support, not sequestration, was what our fund tried to institutionalize. The policy work of 2017 to 2025 had been, in part, about turning sympathetic interpretation into a routine. If a caseworker saw evidence of a neighbor check and a return ticket and the presence of a blue folder, the next practical question became, can we bridge this family to the small resources that will keep the plan viable? The fund offered a narrow answer: yes, in particular instances, we will authorize modest, documented supports, bus fare, a motel deposit, a prepaid phone card, that stabilized the circumscribed plan and allowed the family to keep its life more or less intact while the more structural needs, housing, mental health care, living wages, were addressed in other, slower arenas. March and April 2026 hearings required a choreography of testimony. The mother agreed to testify again, not to plead for absolution but to speak about the logic that had guided her when she bought a plane ticket and left her child for a month. She described the urgency of work invitations in Europe, the calculus of care when she weighed options, the neighbor Janice who had promised to check in daily, and the return ticket she had purchased to keep the contingency tied to time. She did not ask for forgiveness, she asked for programs that understood the texture of survival. Her testimony mattered because it pulled chronology into moral light. This is what scarcity looks like when you are allowed to tell it honestly. She acknowledged the shame she had felt in the immediate aftermath and the shame's legacy in subsequent interactions with systems that sometimes treated the file as a permanent identity rather than a record of a particular time. We called social workers who had been present in the years after 2012 to explain how classifying the case as voluntary allowed for a different trajectory. Not removal but services, not adjudication but referrals. A judge who had once puzzled over the notion of funded plans returned to the bench for the hearing and spoke plainly about the administrative logic that had allowed a child to remain with a parent while supports were arranged. An auditor from the 2023 review testified about comparative trajectories. Families who received time-sensitive, small interventions were less likely to appear in subsequent court calendars or to experience foster care episodes. The numbers were never presented as moral proof. They were evidence for a policy orientation. We also heard testimony that acknowledged the limits. Cases where small supports were insufficient because their needs were structural and long-term. Those acknowledgements were essential. They allowed us to resist both triumphalism and despair. The op-eds and telephone shows did not disappear. The viralized anecdote, 11-year-old with $20, continued to be a rhetorical cudgel. But the hearings forced a more nuanced record into the public domain. The city clerk made available redacted files. The paper published a long-form piece in April 2026 that juxtaposed the mother's testimony with the ledger of receipts and the blue folder contents. The resulting public conversation was less about a single instance of moral failure and more about how public systems adjudicate risk when resources are limited. The commentary did not vanish, but the discourse shifted. People talked about contingency management and trusted anchors as policy concepts. Some of those phrases, Janice as an anchor, the blue folder as a civic technology, felt newly ordinary. The political calendar, however, remained stubborn. The municipal elections in November 2026 had already begun to shape alignments. By May 2026, a slate of candidates had emerged, some of whom promised to cut discretionary spending and to toughen child protective thresholds. Others campaigned on investments in community-based supports, explicitly citing the peer certificate program piloted at the community college in early 2025 as a model. That program, an 18-week certificate that combined classroom pedagogy with field coaching, had, by mid-2025, credentialed 33 peer navigators and placed 21 in paid positions across 3 nonprofits. The evidence of that pilot became fodder for both argument and imitation. Some neighboring counties sought curriculum copies. A state legislator requested program metrics as part of a draft bill that would create a state-level small bridges fund. I found myself oscillating between optimism and worry. Optimism came from the incremental changes, supervisors who authorized night of rents, peers who could mediate panic calls at 2 a.m., community college graduates who brought lived experience into paid careers. Worry persisted because the structural pressures were enormous. A housing market that prized speculation, underfunded mental health systems, and the ever-present possibility that a single administration could shift policy away from prevention to punitive intervention. The ledger of small savories, that crowded set of photographs, receipts, affidavits, remained our best defense, but ledgers are fragile. Budgets can be redrawn, narratives can be shrunk to a headline. On the personal side, the past kept returning in pedagogical form. My son, now old enough to understand dates, asks questions about 2012 and about the suitcase in the attic with the $20 bill. He is less interested in moral absolutes than in the architecture of contingency. Why was Janice allowed to be the anchor? He asks. How did a blue folder keep people from getting taken away? I tell him that it didn't always work, and that sometimes anchors failed, but that public life is made from millions of ordinary commitments. Neighbors who agree to check, caseworkers who can say yes at midnight, supervisors who will authorize $10 for bus fare. I show him the blue folder on the shelf. He examines the faded post-it with Janice's number as if it were an artifact from a distant war. He practices his violin under that shelf and sometimes keeps the suitcase lid open while he tunes, as if the music and the memory were linked. By June 2026, the state-level conversations had intensified. A draft bill circulated in the legislature that proposed a matching fund to help municipalities establish small bridges pools, contingent on reporting and peer training standards. The political calculus was complicated. Supporters argued that the bill would create economies of scale and protect municipal funds during downturns. Critics countered that it would institutionalize a band-aid approach to problems that required investments in housing and mental health. Our testimony at the state hearings hewed to the story we'd been telling for 9 years. Small-dollar interventions are not a cure-all. They are a tactical instrument that buys time and keeps families in place while longer-term investments are pursued. We emphasized the pedagogy of interpretation. Train workers to read contingency as evidence of a plan worth supporting rather than as proof of criminality. We argued for pay for peers, for the continued collection of the ledger, and for an insistence that the ledger be auditable, not anecdotal. A month before the municipal budget vote, a conservative blog ran a piece that again invoked the 11-year-old and the $20 bill, aligning the anecdote with a broader critique of soft-on-parents policies. The piece was shared widely. It prompted a late-night meeting among fund advocates. We rehearsed our chronology: 2012 incident, voluntary services, 2017 pilot, 2020 responsiveness, 2023 audit, 2024 public defense, 2025 pedagogy, and we prepared witnesses who could speak to both individual cases and aggregate outcomes. The day of the municipal vote, several peers testified in the council chamber. One of them, a woman who had been in the system as a teenager, described how receiving small, immediate support in 2019 had prevented a foster care placement and allowed her to finish high school. She had paid taxes since 2022 and mentored other young parents. When she spoke, I watched the mayor lean forward and jot notes. The municipal fund survived that vote, though its line items were tightened and reporting requirements expanded. The victory felt painstaking rather than triumphant. It was a lesson in the political price of nuance. We had to make our administrative practices transparent in ways that satisfied skeptics without turning the peers whose stories mattered into specimens for public consumption. That meant improved privacy protocols and an insistence that consent and anonymity be honored even as measurable outcomes were demanded. It also meant we had to refine our message, document, but dignify the people whose lives you encode into ledgers. The 2026 cycle taught us how quickly public empathy can be eroded and how much work it takes to maintain it. In quieter rooms, beyond the hearings and the op-eds, the work continued to shift the texture of practice. Supervisors learned to carry small contingencies as part of their decision trees. New hires at the agency shadowed peers from the community college program for months. Judges, in off-the-record conversations, shared that their own exposure to the ledger had shifted their questions in arraignment court from "where will the child go?" to "what does the family need to keep this child safe?" That shift in judicial language was slow but real. It did not abolish the trade-offs of a punitive system. It introduced the possibility that adjudication could be the last, not the first resort. The suitcase in the attic remained as much a relic as a teaching device. Sometimes, when a new cohort of peers arrived for training, I brought the suitcase down. We would pass it around the table, its fabric frayed, its leather corners scuffed, and they would hold it as if it were a sacred object. They would listen to my mother's piece of the file, the purchase of a return ticket, the buying of a notebook she used to write instructions, the careful folding of $20 into a purse pocket. The story was told not as an apology but as an account of decisions made under constraint. The peers would then role-play scenarios. A mother calls at midnight saying she cannot pay for the last night of her motel. A father must leave town for work but worries about a teenager with limited food. A parent has been arrested and needs a quick plan for children who must not miss school. The role-plays were pragmatic. They taught the language of contingency and the small operations. Authorize a deposit, call Janice, file a receipt, that preserves civic life. There will be more hearings. There will be more op-eds that try to distill complicated lives into catchy soundbites. There will be elections that test the political durability of small instruments of repair.